IATA did the policing job to see that everyone follows the rules and the fares. And the only advantage the airlines had, or only advantage airlines can get, is by providing great in-flight service, great on-ground service, do some good marketing and sales. It sounds all very easy, but like Mr. Sethi said, in 1959, when Mr. Mahta came to United States to start Air India's first flight, it was really a very marathon task. We have today 2 million Indians living in the United States. And Indians have the highest per capita income among all the ethnic communities in US. Those days there were barely 30,000 Indians in the United States, and maybe about 15 or 18,000 in New York. And our headquarters was 7,800 miles away from New York. And on both sides of the Atlantic, our competitors were well established. British Airways, Lufthansa, Swiss Air, KLM, Air France, and on this side we had Pan Am and TWS, the giant carriers. And it was not an easy task for an airline, the first Asian carrier, to establish across the Atlantic. I remember when our flight started, Mr. Kuka said, we would have been the first across the Atlantic if 15 other carriers had not sneaked in when we weren't looking. And we are certainly not going to be the last across the Pacific. I don't think we have made it in the 50 years that, we have been on the Atlantic. It was, we were in 1960, I joined Air India in 1959 when Air India were to acquire the 707s, the first jet aircraft produced by Boeing Company. And within 3 or 4 years, we had become the first all-jet airline. It sounds very good, but all we had was 7 aircraft. And we were flying from India to US via Beirut, Cairo, Rome, Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, London, all that. We were flying to Tokyo in the east, Sydney in the west via Singapore and Perth, Nairobi, Mauritius, and a few cities in the Gulf with 7 aircraft. So it was not an easy task. And I didn't realize how small we were and how hard the task of Mr. Mahta was in US, till I went in 1970 as an Air India instructor to Chicago for Train the Trainer course, and a domestic carrier called United Airlines had 300 plus aircraft. By then we had about 12 aircraft. I'm trying to just drive home the marathon task that was in front of him to fight all these giant carriers who were well established for 20 odd years before we came to US. And of course, Air India was fortunate in 59-60. Like Mr. Sethi mentioned, we had Bobby Kuka at the helm of affairs in commercial in India, and we had Peter Mahta, Manik Dalal, and Nari Dastur in the West as the regional heads. And they were the absolute guys, that Air India can bank on, and they never let us down. I worked for 5 or 6 bosses in my small career of 25 years because I retired before I was 44. So I only worked 25 years, unlike some of you have worked 40, 45 years. But I'll tell you, and from all bosses I've learned something or the other. But like everyone else said, Mr. Mahta was a very articulate man. He really presented Air India's image in a very prominent way. He was immaculately dressed, always well presented, very personable, and he carried Air India's image very well. he knew when to speak, when not to speak. I think one of the biggest lessons I learned from Mr. Mahta is no one has a finer command of the language than the person who knows when to keep his mouth shut. When Mr. Mahta smiled and didn't say a word when he was asked something, you knew he knows this is not the time to speak. I've been trying to practice, not always succeed though. Going back to, I'll give you an example. I had a friend. Very many Air India executives sometimes open their mouth at the wrong time. And when I was on the West Coast, I had a sales manager, and we had Mr. Gentleman who wrote Freedom at Midnight, Dominic Lapierre in town. And I met him in a party, and I introduced myself as an Air India man and invited him to lunch. And to my great surprise, he accepted it, and he said he will attend with his colleague. So I decided to take my sales manager along, and we were chatting, and he will remain nameless, but we were chatting away, and I made a sign and said, you haven't spoken, kind of. I couldn't speak Hindi because I thought Dominic Lapierre knows Hindi, So I made a sign, and he turns to Mr. Dominic Lapierre and said, Mr. Lapierre, have you ever been to India? So, going back to, Mr. Mahta had an impeccable personality. He had a great smile, confidence in himself. I would say almost had charisma that most people envied. I would say I envied and admired and tried to emulate. Mr. Mahta's strength, of course, and support was Marlene, and Marlene, may God give you strength to bear this irreparable loss. May God rest his soul in peace. God bless.
Our next speaker is Mr. Vijay Rana, who worked with Mr. Mahta when Mr. Mahta joined the Oberoi Group of Hotels after retiring from Air India.
Thank you all for coming to help celebrate Peter's life. I was introduced to Peter Mahta in the mid-70s by Gautam Khanna, who considered Peter as a real friend of his, and with whom he had a very, very long-term relationship. Although Peter will forever be remembered as Mr. Air India in New York, he did have a very successful and stellar second career of nearly 15 years at the Oberois. He joined the Oberois in the early 80s and soon became such an integral part of the Oberoi family that many of the lifers in Oberoi wondered what we had been doing before he came and joined us. During our many years together, we shared adjacent offices, traveled together for company work and for industry events, and he became a major mentor for me personally. Peter was an incredible person who left a very, very strong, positive, and indelible impression on the lives of every single person that he met. In my career, I have never met anybody who had anything but positive praises to speak when we speak of Peter. His positive thinking rubbed off on every one of us in the team at Oberoi, and it is a real credit that in all the time that I spent with him, I never heard him speak negatively about any human being in the world. For me, he was a shining example of what every human being should be: caring, kind, and compassionate. Peter taught me to embrace life and, by example, taught us to live life to its fullest. He in his 50s, he developed his passion for running, and before we knew it, he was running marathons. That to me in Peter, not only to do things in half measures, but if you really want to chase your dream, you should chase it. Peter leaves behind Marlene and all of us friends whose lives are richer today because we have had the privilege of knowing him. Thank you.
Our next presenter is Rosemary Volante, who's going to read a letter that has been sent to us by Edward Macedo, the former sales manager for US and Canada of Air India. Rosemary Volante. And she is also an Air Indian.
I will start off personally also, and I'll make it brief, but I wish that I had known Mr. Mahta as long as all of you have. I came from the Philadelphia office in 1980, and I believe Mr. Mahta had just left his position in New York. But when he came into the Philadelphia office to check things out, I was stunned. I mean, he was the most handsome man I ever saw in my life. I said, oh my God. I said, suppose he asked me a question like what my name is. I don't know what I'll say to him. I couldn't think straight. He was just fantastic. But all the things we've heard were lovely this evening, and I could tell at the social functions that I briefly attended that Mr. Mahta was there. I could tell he was social, precious, great, and he just was wonderful. And look what he did for us. I mean, he loved us so much. I mean, he went out of his way to get us all here tonight, you know? Anyway, once you've met him, you'd never forget him. And this is from Mr. Ed Macedo, a tribute to Mr. Mahta. Unfortunately, for reasons beyond my control, I am unable to personally pay tribute to Mr. Peter Mahta. Marlena, June and I offer our deepest sympathy and share your grief. For me, Mr. Mahta, a guiding light in my life has ceased to shine. I was truly fortunate to have the opportunity of serving directly under his leadership. His passion for perfection always inspired us to share in his belief that only the best was acceptable. He was always the perfect executive exemplar who used persuasion over compulsion, explanation rather than criticism, and more importantly, always expressed reassurance in his staff's capabilities of getting the job done. We lost a truly good human being, an irreplaceable chief, but I am sure, Mr. Mahta, that you will always have a special place in our hearts and memories. You will always be fondly remembered. Ed and June Macedo.
Our next presenter is a gentleman that we've all known in the airline industry and travel industry for a very long time, but he has a new avatar now. He is now known as Reverend Gregory Johnson. Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Johnson.
It's such a joy to be here tonight. Thank you. There, that's good. It's such a joy to be here tonight. It's a reunion in many ways. My partner and I knew Peter and Marlena extremely well. They were the eye of India, we were the eye of Indonesia. And for many years, we met at many, many functions. We shared many things. I had the privilege of being involved with the Oberoi Hotels. It was my first home in Bali, and Biki, and I'm so old I remember Rai Bahadur. So tonight has been a night of many memories, seeing Palave, seeing Victor, being with Andy, and so many others. It's wonderful. And it's so like Peter to bring us all together. The diversity that I'm looking at is what's so wonderful, because it was the oneness. Now, we've heard a lot of words about Peter, But to me, there's only one word. It's the word that I thought of the moment Marlena honored me by asking me to be here tonight. There's only one word: elegance. Inwardly and outwardly. This was a man whose beauty, yes, it was physical, but it stemmed from an internal beauty. And Peter, you can't say his name without saying Marlena. That is what's so wonderful. As I was thinking of items to say, and by the way, I apologize for using the iPad, but I am a multiple stroke survivor, and because you'd like to go home, I've brought it along. Peter and Marlena, elegance personified. And who can wear the same outfit 45 years later and fit into it? I'd like to try that with a few suits. Marlena, it's a joy. It's a joy. We've heard so many stories tonight, and I think I'm going to do what I do better. We've heard so many stories tonight. Thank you. Well, you're a great stage manager. I'm going to take you over to Marble with me. Thank you. That's better. We've heard so many different stories and so many different words about Peter, hearing about his life, hearing about him in Air India, hearing about him in the Oberoi Hotel, hearing personal stories. It is elegance, there's no question. But Marlena said something to me the other day, and I want to share it with them. Because this is the great gift. Marlena was talking about